Good day and welcome to Spotlight, a series of conversations focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights in South Africa. This series is brought to you by Canada's largest international media development organization, Journalists for Human Rights, through its program to mobilize media in the fight against COVID-19 in partnership with Media Monitoring Africa and Sound Africa. I am JD Ramalapa. Today, we're putting a spotlight on the right to freedom of expression in commemoration of World Press Freedom Day, which we marked on Monday. South Africa has dropped one place on the annual Press Freedom Index to number 31. And according to Reporters Without Borders, who compiled the index, while press freedom in South Africa is guaranteed by the Constitution, it has become more fragile in recent years. In its 2021 report, it has revealed how South African state security agencies routinely spy on some journalists, some even tapping others' phones even. And other journalists have been harassed and subjected to intimidation campaigns if they tried to cover certain subjects involving the ruling party or the African National Congress. In 2020, the coronavirus crisis did not spare South African journalists either. Rubber bullets were fired at reporters covering compliance with lockdown measures, and a community newspaper editor even had to flee the country after being threatened by police for covering a lockdown-related story. Something that has been unprecedented in South Africa since the end of apartheid. So to help us discuss this issue even further, we are now joined, as always, by one of our journalists in the MMFC program, Fred Felton, who is the editor and senior writer for the Umhlanga Life, a community newspaper in Durban, South Africa. We are also very honored to have Marystella Simiyu, who is the program coordinator for the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria. Welcome to Spotlight, and thank you both for your time. Let me start with you, Felton. When COVID-19 lockdown measures were introduced in South Africa last year, we saw a level of police brutality that was reminiscent of apartheid, targeting the public and media organizations. What was your experience of it? Did you experience harassment and assault from the police?
Hi, Judy. Thanks for sharing the opportunity. I myself did not experience it myself firsthand, but I can tell you of what it was like when it hit, and the fact that you had to now get a government gazette and you had to print out certain documents and get them signed, and you even had to get an official press card, which is pretty hard for community newspapers. And, I can imagine what it was like, in the bad old days, having to walk around with this like press card and just hoping that the police don't stop you. And I do know of journalists that, especially when they wanted to cover the beachfront area, there were quite a few police there asking them, what are you doing there? Why are you here? It's lockdown. And they had to pull out all of this documentation, had to be signed by editors, had to be, why are you here? What story are you doing? And, it became very limited. You had limited freedoms, limited space where you could go. People asking you, what are you taking pictures here for? What are you doing here? So it kind of limits you as a journalist when you're trying to do a story.
Yeah, considering all of those limitations that was imposed on the press as well, how has it changed or affected the way that you report on a daily basis? Do you kind of now have to filter the types of stories that you go after?
Certainly we do, and it's not just related to COVID. It's also related to social media. The way that one post that you send out can basically bury your career. We've seen it in the last couple of years where people have posted something and they're being fired, or they've lost their jobs. Or sometimes it's based on a certain advertiser that you're dealing with. Am I going to offend that advertiser if I post the story? You know, you've got to be thinking about various words that you use, various phrases, even pictures. You have to decide, is this picture going to offend a certain group, and are they going to come after me? So certainly, as a journalist nowadays, you're looking more at self-censorship and checking yourself, whereas in the past, you had much more freedom.
Yeah. Let me move to you, Marystella. Your research focuses on freedom of expression and digital rights. Should we be worried in South Africa, considering these trends that we're seeing on encroachment of some, press freedom in the country?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Lady, for that. I think there is a bit of need to worry, but even as I heard you mention, the World Press Freedom Index and how South Africa is ranked, I thought it is good to acknowledge first that while there are some challenges in South Africa, which you did mention, it is doing well as compared to other countries. It was above UK and the US. But when I was looking at my research, what I thought was concerning about South Africa and in the context of COVID is the regulations that came about and how they affected freedom of expression. So for example, when the regulations that were made under the Disaster Management Act, and they ended up sort of criminalizing the publication of false statements around COVID-19. When you talk about, for example, if you have an intention to deceive somebody about, COVID-19 status or actions taken by government. What we flagged in my research, and as well as the work we do at the Center for Human Rights, particularly in the Expression, Information and Digital Rights Unit, is that the way that section was phrased was quite vague and very broad. And the problem of having such vague provisions, which criminalize the spreading of false news around COVID-19, is that as a citizen and as other people who are talking about COVID-19, is that you're not quite sure which speech and which action will land you into trouble, what is regulated and what is not regulated. And even worse still, why I think we even had these incidences around harsh state response when it came to implementation of lockdown procedures, is that they were given this provision, and I think there was not a lot of guidance on what conduct is regulated and what conduct is not regulated. And this was in a context where we have this pandemic, a lot of new information is coming up from other implementing sources, from our states and government. There's a lot of uncertainty around COVID-19, and we're not quite sure how to guide our speech and conduct around COVID-19. So when we had these regulations that South Africa passed, as well as other countries in Africa, it became concerning in how they will implement these regulations and how they will affect our freedom of speech in this regard. And we saw actually these laws were used. In Cape Town, there was the man who was arrested for the statements he made that the government was going around with contaminated COVID tests. There was a man in Hammarskraal who recorded himself saying COVID-19 does not exist, and they were charged under this act. But while it is important to regulate and to manage health misinformation in the context of a pandemic, we have to ensure that how the state is doing it is in such a way that does not end up infringing on how we actually exercise our freedom of speech. And that is what we saw in a lot of contexts, not only in South Africa, but beyond. But really what you mentioned about the online, the attacks against government, the police brutality against journalists, which caused, journalists to flee or feel unsafe in this context. It was quite unfortunate, especially given the fact that journalists were out there getting this information to us. We had the option of, if we didn't want to engage with information on COVID, we could just as well not engage with that information online. But journalists had to be out there as essential workers, gathering this information and presenting to us during news. But they were now subject to physical attacks, as well as sometimes to see online attacks against against journalists by governments, opposition, and even ordinary citizens. So really, the incidences we see where we see attacks against government is very unfortunate in this context of a pandemic.
I think
Thank you.
what I find very interesting, Mary, is where do we actually draw the line between misinformation and maybe even government propaganda in this instance, if you are saying that the laws are so broad that are governing sort of freedom of speech here. So when do we know when we're actually dealing with actual real conversations that we need to have as a society? And here I'm referring to that case with the constitutional judge Mogoeng, who was sharing his opinion about whether or not he wants to take the vaccine. And so maybe I would like for you maybe to weigh in on this and tell us how do we deal with this going forward?
Okay, so even here we can look at issues of just the definition. You know, misinformation, we are doing misinformation. Often a lot of us are guilty of misinformation. You get something, you're not sure whether it's true or false, you forward it without actually going out there and confirming. And then there's you sharing your opinion. Sometimes it could land you in problems, sometimes it could not. But I think an important thing to consider is the status of the person sharing it. So for example, if I share something, no, I cannot even use myself, because in face we are assuming that we are going to be responsible consumers of news and responsible sharers of news, so that we are not actually sharing misinformation out there. So that means before we share anything, we just take a bit, go online, check different sources. What have people said? Has this been debunked by any source or whatnot? If that has happened and you can see that this is credible information, you can share. But then it could be in a situation where you don't know and you're just sharing your opinion. But if you're in a certain position where, let's say you're an influencer or you're a leader who has access to a number of followers, then whatever you share, you have a responsibility towards your audience. You might end up sharing something that is shared and has a real impact in terms of the actions of people. So that is something to consider. But you asked something about, you know, how do we say that this is misinformation, it's government propaganda? Because often, sometimes we have the government channeling that information out there. And I think at the end of the day, this goes into how we consume news. Are we able to, again, go out there? Because now with access to the internet, there's diverse sources where we can look at information and verify whether that information is correct or not. So as consumers of news, let's go out there, look at the different sources, see whether the media anywhere has been able to debunk any of this information, and then we can reshare or share information that is truthful, so that at least even as us, we can have a sort of responsibility towards what information is there. Is it truthful? Is it not? Yeah.
Fred, let me ask you, many of the journalists that I have been working with in the past couple of weeks have been sharing with me that normal, ordinary citizens feel very afraid to speak to the media or express their opinion for fear of some kind of backlash. Have you experienced similar trends in your line of work?
Yes, certainly. I think people are scared. They don't want to lose their jobs, even in government. So you'll find that people will say, I'm not allowed to speak to you. Please speak to this department. And you can never get hold of that department. So you're kind of stuck. There is no comment coming. So people certainly are, or please call me anonymous, or some made up name, because they just don't want to, take that risk. Just of course, based on what you see on social media, like people just losing jobs, things like that, just because they maybe spoke to the media. And I certainly agree with this misinformation and fake news, during the times of COVID, especially on WhatsApp. We found so much of this, and it's so hard to track what is real and what is not. And people were posting articles that if you actually looked at them, they were actually from 3 years before COVID. So you couldn't really actually believe that. It's always things like have been forwarded many times. So please forward this on to as many people as you can. And only then do you start to see that, okay, this is fake news. And because there's so much fake news out there, people don't want to become part of this train, and they don't want to risk losing their job. So certainly I have experienced where people just don't want to speak to you, or they pass the buck.
Mm. Marystella, what does this mean for democracy in South Africa? Because we know that human rights are interrelated. And so what does it mean when people are feeling that they're unable to express themselves or share their opinion publicly? What does it mean if journalists are beginning to self-censor? What does it mean for this country's democracy going forward?
Well, that is really an important question because especially for journalists, because we know journalists make up the fourth estate. They play a very big role in terms of ensuring transparency and accountability from government, and just also ensuring that we as the public have access to credible information to guide our actions. So when we are in this context where, you know, because of the laws that are there, because of the actions of governments, because of the action of police officers, feel the need to censor ourselves, it does take away in how we can exercise these freedoms that we have, how we can express ourselves. But even as I say this, I do have to acknowledge, yes, freedom of expression is not an unlimited right. We know that. You cannot express yourself in such a way that will end up damaging the reputation of others, infringing the rights of other people, or, for example, what propaganda for war. This we know is a limitation to freedom of speech. And we have at least organizations out there that go out there and, you know, engage with the public, and we say, you know, you have this right, yes, the right to freedom of expression, but with this, you have certain responsibilities to ensure that while you express yourself, it does not end up going against these certain limits. And often governments say that, you know, we limit freedom of speech in such a way that to ensure we maintain public order, we protect national security, or in the context of COVID, we promote public health, or in other cases, you know, public morals. But now in doing so, unfortunately, we see in many circumstances, especially when it comes to public order issues and national security issues, we see a lot of governments in Africa end up misusing this provision to stifle freedom of speech. And because of that is now when we see incidences where people see a need to censor themselves so that they do not get sanctioned because of their expression. And you talked about how, you know, within interdivisibility and these human rights are related. We see that if we cannot express ourselves, it's limiting which information we can access and how we can interact with this information. If we look at it in the context of, for example, elections, it limits how we are able to realize the right to political participation. Because as a voter, I am working with the assumption that when I go to the polls, and that is the aspiration that when we go to the polls, we are going to the polls as informed citizens. We have been able to engage with information, both in media platforms, traditional media platforms, as well as online platforms, and we have access to this credible information, and it will guide the decisions that we make. We see political candidates increasingly going online so as to engage with their electorate and possible supporters. They do this online. And so when we have this space where we exercise our freedom of expression, as well as the traditional media and online media, if we see that this space has been stifled to such an extent that we're censoring ourselves, it does impact and compromise how we'll be able to, you know, now exercise our right to political participation. And beyond that, I think another right that we keep talking about in this context is, you know, our right to privacy. When you find yourself censoring yourself, sometimes it's because when journalists sometimes censor themselves or ordinary citizens, is because there's now this fear of surveillance that is now an increasingly growing fear in this space. We see countries in Africa, South Africa included, Kenya, Uganda, there have been we see governments acquiring surveillance technology, and often this is used to target critical voices such as journalists and human rights defenders and certain other ordinary citizens who are quite vocal about the actions of government. And when we see governments employing these surveillance technologies to look into and surveil journalists and citizens, there is a fear there that can cause journalists and other ordinary citizens and critical voices to censor themselves. While countries like South Africa do have data protection acts that also now try to ameliorate the effect of such surveillance technology, we actually have to see whether our data protection laws are implemented. South Africa has it, Ghana has it, a few countries in Africa have it, but really the regulatory framework when it comes to protecting our data as well as our right to privacy, both online and offline, is not very strong in Africa, and there's need to improve on that.
Yeah. With the onset of COVID-19, we saw that many of our lives moved to the digital world as we are here now discussing this topic via Zoom. And that also has led to other governments and countries sort of clamping down on the internet access and closing down certain sites. For example, in Uganda during elections, in Senegal as well, and Ethiopia. Is the right to, like the digital rights becoming the next frontier, perhaps, when we're talking about the right to freedom of expression or the right to access information?
Who do you want to take this? Should I take this?
Yes, please, Mary. Sorry. It's your area.
Well, I'd say that is the aspiration, that we are moving to a future where we have not just internet access, but universal, equitable, affordable, and meaningful access to the internet. While that is the aspiration, I don't know how close we are to achieving that as Africa, because if we look at internet penetration already in Africa, we are at around 39%. We are lagging behind other continents. Then there's the gendered aspect of it. Under these low internet penetration rates, men have more opportunities and boys have more opportunities to engage in this space as compared to women and girls. Then beyond that, we have concerns of poverty. Are we going to, poverty as well as high cost of data, are we going to buy food or are we going to buy data? This affects how we are able to access this space, this internet online space. Digital literacy is already still a concern in Africa, and it's something that African governments generally, South Africa does it well. South Africa is ahead of a lot of countries in Africa, but in terms of just integrating digital literacy into our educational curriculum such that we are building a generation that can be able to engage in this space, and not only just engage, but engage responsibly in the online space. This is the aspiration if we are able to conquer these goals. But while we are trying to achieve this goal, and you have mentioned Uganda, while we are trying to achieve this aspiration where the right to internet access is a right, we are now having to deal with certain policies, laws, by governments that are actually infringing on how we exercise rights in this space. You mentioned Uganda, which introduced the social media tax. It was supposed to, they said ostensibly it was supposed to be used to increase revenue from these platforms, but really it was just a way to, trample on our freedom of expression in Uganda, as well as access to information. But recently they realized that the introduction of this tax is not actually being beneficial. And so they are seeking to introduce a law that will directly now target taxation of internet as opposed to social media taxation. That is still under discussion. We'll see how it pans out, but really we can all agree that will have a dire effect when it comes to how people are able to exercise FOE, as well as access information through internet platforms, especially for lower income groups. I think another concern we can raise in this regard, which is an impediment to whether we'll achieve this rights to internet as a right recognized in Africa, is just the cyber laws that we see in Africa. More so if we look at them, and this is a project that the Expression and Information and Digital Rights Unit of the Center did in collaboration with other partners in Africa. We looked at the cyber laws that are emerging in Africa. And our concern was that while it is important to protect the cyberspace, what we are seeing are cyber laws that do more towards impeding freedom of speech and expression online, as opposed to protecting this space to ensure that we are able to exercise our expression, our freedom of expression, as well as access to information online. So that is something worrying that we see, that honestly is it's just an impediment to how we'll achieve this aspiration of internet access as a right in the future. In addition, to internet shutdowns, which we are seeing in a lot of countries in Africa, and they happen during critical moments such as elections, as well as protests, where we see countries under the guise of promoting and protecting national security and public order, they shut down the internet. And usually in the background, it gives room for rumors to breed or for government to take part in certain nefarious actions. Just to, for example, if there's a context of fraudulent elections, this information blackout allows for certain agents to ensure that the results tilt towards a certain side. And it's very unfortunate that is happening in a lot of countries in Africa during elections.
Fred, let me come to you. You mentioned earlier in the discussion that you've had to do a lot of things during the COVID-19 lockdown period to sort of access information or even go out and report. What are some of the ways that you have incorporated in your organization or in your community newspaper now to deal with sort of the hesitation from the general public to speak to journalists or covering stories that you think are important? So how are you going about it right now when more people are less likely to say yes to a request for an interview?
Well, I think it's best to persevere. Yes, people won't speak to you, but eventually you'll find someone who will speak to you. So it might not be the person you're looking for, but eventually at the end of the day, you might just have to say that, you know, despite numerous attempts to get comment from this organization or this government spokesperson, you just couldn't get it. But it's about what are the stories at the moment, what are people talking about? Obviously at the moment people are talking about the vaccine, when are we getting it, how much, you know, should we take it, should we not take it? So it's more about what people are talking about at the moment. Those are the stories we cover, and can we do it remotely? That's the first thing we look at. Or do we have to go out on the street? Okay, fine. We got no problem with doing it. And if we can't find someone who will speak to us, well, we just keep persevering until we find someone who will speak to us. And we're very open about, you know, you don't have to be, you know, give your full name, or, you know, we can use a different name for you if you're worried about, you know, using your job or things like that. So we're very open as a media organization where if we feel people really deserve this story, and we're willing to go to any lengths to give it to them, you know, no matter what it takes.
Yeah. Marystella, it seems like it's become high stakes for everyone out there. So what can we do then to empower ourselves going forward in order to still maintain some level of free expression and also be able to access information either in the physical realm or virtually?
Honestly, I think it's just, you know, up to us to stand up against practices that are impeding on our freedom of speech and access to information. When governments do certain actions that we know are against international human rights law and standards when it comes to FOA and ATI, we need to speak out against this. And this is dependent on, you know, having a strong and vibrant media, an independent media that is able to call out government when it does that. It also depends on civil society, a strong and vibrant civil society movement that is able to call out government and any other agent that engages in any action or passes any law that in itself is going to infringe on how we exercise our freedom of speech and expression, as well as access to information on the internet. And when this happens, it at least calls out governments and state actors in this way so that they can see there's an eye out here. We are holding you accountable for the actions that you do. We are here pushing for democracy in Africa, for our rights to be respected and realized in this space. I think that is the best way we can do in terms of protecting ourselves.
Yes, unfortunately, we'll have to end it there. And that's all we have time for today on Spotlight, a series of conversations focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights in South Africa. The series is brought to you by Journalists for Human Rights in partnership with Media Monitoring Africa and Sound Africa. You can send an email to info@soundafrica.org for more information, or follow us here on our Facebook page for updates on this and other stories we've covered. Thank you very much, Fred, and to you, Marystella, for coming and sharing such beautiful insights. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay safe and sound.